Hi! I know it's been a really long time since the last devlog, and I'm really sorry about that. First there was Christmas, then exams, and the things I've been working on also just sort of take a while. At the end of January, I decided to postpone this devlog by a month since I didn't really have much of anything to show at that point, and opted instead to make a longer devlog this month. I also have a surprise for you at the end of the video, but without further ado, let's get right into it. If you watched last month's devlog right till the end, you might remember me saying that this month was going to be all about the guns, and it absolutely was. Project Isolation has multiple gameplay loops, but as an FPS, the shooter part of that is really important. I know for me, if I'm playing a first-person shooter and the gunplay sucks, I'm likely not going to be playing that first-person shooter for much longer. As such, I wanted to build a really solid foundation for Project Isolation, because the previous weapons were a little, bland, to say the least. A big part of how a weapon feels is how it's actually displayed on screen, and outside of the weapon model, a big part of that is animations. As a solo dev, this is one of those things that I'd like to get done as fast as possible, so my first approach to this was actually procedural, and you saw it in the last two episodes, courtesy of the FPS Animation Blueprint Marketplace asset. While that is a great asset, this ended up not giving me quite as much control as I would have liked. I decided then to go the custom animation route, making my own handcrafted animations for each gun. Now there's just two problems. One, I have no idea how to animate, and two, I honestly have no idea how to animate. Please send help. One thing I have learned though is that a good rig makes animating a whole lot easier. So I set that as my first goal, and over Christmas break I gave making a good rig a few attempts. In the end, with some help from YouTube and David RB, who kindly shared the rig he's using with me, I was able to come up with what I feel is a pretty solid rig. Everything is driven through the IK gun bone, meaning that through moving just one bone, I can get most of the movement that I'd need in an animation, which saves me a ton of time fiddling around with lots of tiny little bones. By the way, if you'd like a tutorial on this, let me know in the comments. With a semi-decent rig created, I figured it was worth testing it out, and so I made this small anim set of a PPSH model I had lying around for testing, and was actually pretty happy with what I managed to come up with. While I was working on this, I got an interesting idea. Since this is an indie game, I'm doing everything I can to maximize the impact of my work so I don't have to do as much by hand. Therefore, in order to greatly increase weapon variety, I decided to procedurally generate weapons from lots of different pieces. I didn't want to go full Borderlands, where I was generating weapons that are questionable. Rather, what I was thinking of was more of an attachment system on steroids, where rather than simply changing out the sights and the muzzle attachment, I'd be able to change the actual ammunition that the weapon fires, the type of magazine that it uses, etc., leading to a weapon system that's much more interesting than your standard attachments, as it changes the gameplay in more significant ways. The next step was to come up with a gun to add to the game and make animations for. Now, I should probably explain beforehand my reasoning for why I choose certain weapons. Since this is a game that takes place in the post-apocalypse, I wanted some guns that could potentially be made in a post-apocalypse to be used by the most common enemies. And the first thing that I thought of when I thought of an easy-to-make, simple, modifiable gun was the British Sten. This was a gun that saw very widespread use through Europe and in the Second World War, and as a result had a lot of modifications made to it, which I thought would make for a lot of interesting gameplay variety. Not every gun will have this range of modifications, but the Sten is going to be encountered quite frequently, and I wanted that to stay interesting for the player. The first step was gathering references, so I went through and I found a bunch of images of how I want the gun to look when it's finished, as well as some of the different modifications that I'd like to add to it. Following that and some planning, it was time to actually model the weapon and all of its modifications. I ended up with what I think is a fairly varied set of modifications. There are lots of different sights, muzzle attachments, and even different, what I call magazine types. These are able to fundamentally change the way the weapon plays by changing what kind of ammunition it uses, as well as details such as rate of fire. I know that most of these aren't very historically accurate, and some of them are pretty cursed actually, but that's okay. Project Isolation isn't a historical game, and this variety leads to a ton of fun. In fact, with the currently implemented modifications, the Sten accounts for a whopping 2,100 unique weapons. It took almost a whole week to actually model the guns, and then another few days to rig and UV unwrap them. Once that was done, it was finally time to start making the animations that they would use in-game. I started with idle animations, both for hipfire and when the player is aiming down sights, and then moved on to building a reactive movement system through the use of 4 directional animations. Basically, we make animations for moving forwards, backwards, left and right, and let Unreal's interpolation handle the rest. To test the first animations I created, I had to get the guns into the game. However, figuring out how to actually create the spawning system for these attachments proved to be quite a challenge. My initial idea was to do this using actors, and spawning, then attaching them to the weapon base we created in the first episode. However, as someone in the UE Slackers Discord pointed out, this is really dumb. Which makes sense, because I'm dumb. So at least that checks out. The lovely people in the UE Slackers Discord pointed me towards data tables, and after one all-nighter and a lot of tea, I managed to convert my entire weapon system to using them as practice. Following that, I started writing the actual weapon attachment system. The way this works is that we have 5 predefined skeletal meshes on top of the base skeletal mesh for the weapon, which act as empty slots for each different type of attachment. In the engine, we have a data table, which stores a host of information about our individual attachments. They have general information, such as the given attachment's impact on the recoil or bullet spread, and most importantly, the skeletal mesh of the attachment. On top of that, we have type-specific characteristics. For example, the sight attachment will determine the sight offset, the magazine, the ammunition variables, such as the ammunition type, etc. Within the constructor, we create the 5 skeletal meshes, but we don't actually assign them. When we have ensured that the weapon has been successfully created, we can actually run the spawn attachment function, which populates the skeletal meshes with the relevant values from the data table by doing a lookup function using the names of each row. Now that we have those values, we're free to use them in the actual game. This, however, has some slightly larger ramifications than I initially expected. Prior to this, the most specific a weapon could be was a class, but now that we have these procedural attachments, every instance of a weapon class can be different, meaning that we can no longer store the player's 2 weapons as just a class reference and spawn that every time we switch to it. Since we no longer have one skeletal mesh for the weapon, but rather 6 individual ones, a lot of the particles, line traces, and really anything that depends on the specific bone names of the mesh isn't working, since these, well, don't exist anymore. This also poses difficulties for the weapon pickup system that needs to go hand in hand with this new attachment system, which was built to work with classes, not instances. The ammunition handling system I introduced way back in the first devlog is also totally out of the picture now, since there's no way we can keep track of the ammunition by class now, since that won't support the variety of magazine attachments that are available for weapons. All in all, the whole system is pretty foobar. In retrospect, I probably should have expected this, but I'll admit to being more than a little unprepared to just how much was going to break when I implemented the new attachment system. It was truly a dreary time, with days passing before I was able to get the project to compile again, and more than 2 weeks and a visit from the legendary Professor rework before I was able to interact with all the systems without the game crashing. Now that you could actually use weapons again, it was time to make them feel good. Like I said at the beginning of the devlog, in large part this comes down to recoil and sound effects, so those were naturally what I worked on. I picked up a lovely new sound pack from the Unreal Engine Marketplace for sound effects, and built a new curve-driven recoil system that allows weapons to have fully reproducible recoil, much like something like CSGO, rather than me just generating random numbers for the amount of recoil after each shot. I also implemented a recoil recovery system, which wasn't easy. I tested a few games for how they did theirs, and ended up creating something similar to Destiny 2's recoil recovery system, where as long as you don't move your mouse, guns will snap back to where you were last aiming before you fired, but if you do move the mouse, then there's no snapback. This is also driven by a curve, and I'm actually really happy with how it feels. As you've probably seen in the footage here, I also set up systems to allow for lots of different kinds of sights, added particles for ejected shell casings, and made a bunch of small improvements under the hood with various bug fixes and performance improvements. My one main goal with all of this work though was to create a build that you guys could actually play and try out and give me feedback on. To facilitate this, I decided to make a new test map for you all to play. I made targets, a weapon vending machine, shooting ranges, a money system, and so much more. I'm super pleased to present the trailer for Alpha 0.1 of Project Isolation. So there you have it. You can download it now on itch.io and give me feedback either through the comments or the forum linked in the pause menu. There are still definitely a bunch of bugs and issues that I'll be ironing out over the coming weeks, like whatever this animation is and the criminal lack of reloading animations. I've been super busy and had to really crunch in order to get this out now rather than in another month, so I'm really sorry for any rough edges. I'm gonna try and be a little more consistent with uploads from here on out. I'm really sorry for leaving you guys hanging like this. On the topic of future devlogs and updates, I'm going to try and add a new weapon to the game each month, and next month I'm going to be able to give you a lot more info about the actual structure of the game, as well as some teases about the lore in the world. With that said, that's it for me for these 2 months. Thank you so much for sticking with me till the end of the video. I'd love to hear your thoughts on all the new systems coming to Project Isolation. As always, if you'd like access to the project source code, it's down in the description, along with links to follow the game's progress. Thanks so much for watching, happy development, and I'll see you soon.